Hi, everyone. Hello. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so actually, let's do a quick activity because I know everyone must be tired. It's like after you ate and you feel a little bit drowsy. So why don't we do something called a power pose? You can do this sitting down, or you can do this getting up. We're gonna do your favorite power pose. You can do a superhero pose. You can do anything that makes you feel powerful. Okay, so you can get up if you'd like. You can stay seated. We can do it all together. Okay, and we're gonna hold this for about 5 seconds. I'll do it with you, I promise. Okay, ready, set, go. Hold it for 5 seconds. We're almost there. Okay. That was like less than 5 seconds, but I'm sorry about that timing. Hi, everyone. My name is Nasma Ahmed. I am currently a fellow at the Ford Foundation and Mozilla Foundation. Most of my work, as Julie said, is in the intersections of social justice, technology, and policy. Most recently, I've been focusing on digital privacy and security as it relates to diverse communities. I was raised on the internet. The internet helped shape a lot of my social interactions growing up. I remember a really pivotal moment when social interactions started to change into online platforms. We used to spend hours on end on 6-way phone calls, sometimes 9-way phone calls. We found ways to do that. And then all of a sudden it started to shift to MSN and Facebook. We had fake ages on Facebook. I was 68 years old. And we had fake ages, and we used like Facebook status updates to talk about teen angst and our favorite love songs. This was an interesting moment for me because all of a sudden social interactions were on online platforms. There was another global community that I could talk to. And I started to think about privacy and surveillance at a very young age. As a young racialized woman, we're told to be weary about who's watching, how can that impact you, and how that relates to who you are. I remember one day, it was about 7th grade or 8th grade, I got a knock on my door. It was my dad. He had a folder with a couple of sheets of paper. He sat myself, my mother, and I down and looked rather serious, and I kept thinking, holy crap, what did I do? And he took out the sheets of paper, and it was 3 pages of my MSN status updates. Just think about that. All of your, angsty stuff on sheets of paper. And I kept thinking to myself, I'm pretty sure I blocked my dad on MSN. And how in the world did he have access to this? Little did I know that actually on MSN, when you go on Hotmail, it'd actually have a feed of all the status updates from the people that you actually had on your contact list. And I didn't know that at the time, so that's why I had a list of my MSN statuses in front of me. And, he asked me, are you in love with a boy or something? Like, what's going on here? He didn't know this, but it was actually quite popular to post your favorite love songs or favorite songs at the time, and I was super into R&B, so my statuses were a mixture of love, despair, and heated romance. I ended up getting banned on MSN. I still used it, but I got banned. And I actually changed my status into some inspirational quote, and I left it there until MSN was shut down completely. And, this was one of my first instances of digital surveillance, right? Obviously, we're always watched anyways, right? With corporations collecting our data, and I already knew that, but this was the first time where I noticed this vulnerability, right? It was in my face. It was on a sheet of paper. All the things that I was talking about online was available to my father. And this is when it started to help shape how I thought about privacy and surveillance. It did have a chilling impact on me. I definitely changed the way that I had access settings, and I really made sure that people cannot watch me, but everyone's watching in their own ways. Yes, I had access to these digital tools and the internet, but I didn't have a lot of power. And as we frame what digital inclusion means to us here in this room, we must understand the ways communities are impacted by surveillance and how this is replicated and exacerbated by digital tools. Digital inclusion is often viewed as a positive thing, right? You have remote communities, underserved populations who have access to tools, also just realized, really funny, that I wasn't using my slides. So let's experience that together. That's me exploring the internet. That's my dad finding out that I was on a platform and my MSN status updates. And that's us watching you. That's PowerPoints, right? And so, as we understand digital inclusion, it often is viewed in a positive way. The availability of digital tools, access, and broadband for underserved populations. But research has shown that we should be hesitant about this, hesitant about the harmful effects of surveillance that can hinder direct positive impacts of digital inclusion. I'd like to cite Virginia Eubanks, because in Virginia Eubanks' book, Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in an Information Age, Virginia did a study on a local YWCA community technology project. And what she realized in her research was what actually stopped people from participating was not access. It was power, privilege, and oppression. And it was okay that they had access to the web, but these participants shared the concerns of often being surveilled. They were from low-income and marginalized communities, and they recognized that they were being surveilled by employers, by various public assistance programs that also relied on digital technologies. Surveillance impacted the way that interacted with digital tools, and the same can be said for many communities all across Canada. Having access to digital technologies and the internet has become a necessity. We use it to access our jobs, we use it to access public assistance programs, and we use it to check up with family and friends. I want to, Virginia Eubanks is in her most recent book, Automating Inequality, which I think all of you should be talking about and also reading, is she expands on the fact that surveillance and data collection negatively impacts low-income and poor families in the US through the digitization of public assistance projects. And the most recent example that I can talk about here of digital surveillance that we might have all remembered is the RCMP tracking Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, Palestinian and Jewish activists via social media platform Facebook. This was the article. And, obviously, social media, it's like policing, surveilling is already a part of policing, but digital tools make it easier for it to happen. And through the hyper-surveillance of social media platforms, we're able to collect sensitive data from marginalized communities to serve a political agenda. From ad bias to police surveillance to employer surveillance, this further marginalizes communities that already experience state and structural violence. Oh, the slide's not working. There we go. I want to quote James Baldwin. Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? Think about that. It illustrates just how these systems weren't optimized with marginalized people in mind. Currently, there is a power imbalance here, and marginalized communities are negatively impacted by it. It's not just marginalized communities, it's all of us in many ways. Access to broadband and digital tools have become a necessity to our everyday lives. But in this work, we rarely negotiate what the power imbalance actually is. And this isn't just about integrating poor communities into a beautiful digital society, because digital technologies often replicate the same inequalities we see in our everyday lives. The digital world is not majestic and magical in its form, and it is integral that we navigate and speak truth to the power imbalance that's currently happening right now, as we experience the internet, as we experience these digital tools. We must not reiterate and recreate the same structural inequalities that impact marginalized communities and also all of us. We should actually cultivate new forms of community power and community care to actually think about our digital futures and how it relates to our digital futures. I think it's really important for us to highlight projects that are doing really well right now and who have actually navigated and spoke truth to power. Because it is important for us as we do this work to constantly navigate that. Because in many ways, we are the product. And so I want to highlight two projects in particular. The first one is the Our Data Bodies Project. The Our Data Bodies Project is based in the US, and they navigate the ways in which data is collected from governments and corporations. And their work is with local communities. They find ways of making information accessible, especially with marginalized communities, to understand the ways that your data is collected and how that might impact you. And it's all participatory. And guess what? They're all predominantly women of color. And so the second project I wanted to highlight is from my dear friend, Joanna. Joanna runs an organization called Coding Rights. She's also another fellow, part of the program. And she has this project called Chuchapadas, which you should all look up because they actually have it in English as well. And Chuchapadas is a visual storytelling platform sharing stories from all over Latin America. And they're showing about how our bodies, the relation of bodies and data, and the ways in which it interacts with one another and impacts our lives. The great thing about this project is it actually amplifies stories that are relatable to us. They have a really cool blog post about menstruation apps that I find very fascinating, about how menstruation apps collect data, and then the next one about also how your credit score is calculated. And I think it's important to highlight these projects because there is work being done right now to navigate the power structures that are set in place. And digital inclusion, yes, it's directly related to access, but when we talk about inclusion, we have to navigate not only access, but we have to navigate power. And this can be connected, yes, you have, as an individual, yes, you may have access to a tool, you may have access to the internet, but do you feel like you have power or agency over how your data is shared, how your data is stored, and how your habits or your use cases can be used against you? And as digital inclusion becomes more and more important in Ontario and in Canada, we have to recognize our relation to technology and be honest about it, and be honest about the structures that are set in place. And as I said, we are the product in many ways, right? Our data is being collected, fed back to us. Those ads are getting super specific these days, and we're all probably noticing that, and we're becoming more and more connected, which comes with a lot of risks that we have yet to navigate in the public sphere. It is our role as practitioners, as teachers, as policymakers, as people that work in the nonprofit world to critically engage with power as a way of shaping our digital futures. You see, I think about surveillance and privacy a lot in the work that I do as a way of understanding interventions for protecting our digital futures. And this is where actually digital justice comes to play. The digital issues we see today, for example, surveillance and privacy issues, will continue to expand and intensify. It is important now more than ever that, It is important now more than ever to shape our digital futures, to ensure it is just and equitable for all. I think about this quote a lot, and it navigates my work. And Adrienne Maree Brown once stated, "To really transform our society, we will need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have." I want us to think about that one more time. And I'm going to repeat it one more time because I really want you to think about this in the work that you do. To really transform our society, we will need to make justice one of the most pleasurable experiences we can have. How can we do that with digital issues? How can we make sure we are critical of systems, building community infrastructure together, and collaborating with diverse communities? Because if it's all of us or none of us, and we have to constantly think about that. And in building our digital futures together, we must recognize there are alternatives to this box that we're in. And we need to continue to foster imagination because we can think about other things from socially to economically and technologically that can advance us in different ways. We don't have to think about this square box that we're currently placed in. And sometimes we forget the internet was created about 25 years ago and became accessible to the masses about 22 years ago. It's not that long ago. And so we have to navigate how we can make this accessible for all of us, but also recognize the power that's set in place and the fact that community infrastructure is an important part of it, and justice and equity is an important part of it. And I ask you all, as you navigate your role in digital inclusion, as you get back to work on Monday, and as you think about this over the weekend, that you build with community and not for community. I know we repeat that a lot, but I think it becomes even more integral in digital issues. Recognize the need to build agency and power. How do people understand the way their data is controlled? Are there better ways that we can navigate data protection laws? How do we navigate that together? And give yourself moments for self-reflection. I think this is an important one, because I think that sometimes we get caught up in this work, and we have to sit down, reflect if we're actually recreating structural inequalities ourselves and we may not realize it, and also just give ourselves a moment to recognize that this is a race, right? And this is like gonna happen for a really long time. It's a long-term race here. And so we need to reflect and take care of ourselves in this work. And I think it's important for us to critically engage institutional powers, whether be it government or corporations or any other entity. We also must prioritize justice and equity in everything that we do. And lastly, as Maya Angelou once said, when you learn, you teach, and when you get, give. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just gonna get some water. Yeah, absolutely. But first, Hi, everyone.
Thank you.
No problem.
This morning, Shelley and Zena said they had a, what did you guys call it, on a fangirl on Angela? Yeah, we're fangirling on Nasma. Yep. When you were talking about technology in the early days, I was thinking of our party line when I grew up. We lived on a farm, and we had to pick up the phone, and one of 3 neighbors might be on the phone, but if they weren't, then we could use the phone. Shows my age.
Yeah.
Excellent. 3. So we have lots of questions on Slido. We also have, Denise has a microphone for questions in the room. Let's maybe start off in the room.
Any questions?
Oh, okay, they need some time to think about it, so I'll go to Slido.
Awesome.
Question about the cultural aspects to inclusion. What are key things that we should know?
Cultural aspects. That we all have different experiences as it pertains to digital tools. I think that's important to recognize. So for example, I work with a lot of young Muslim women, so the way that they navigate online spaces is actually quite different than a lot of folks. And so I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the habits that we actually have in our physical world actually replicate into our digital world as well. And so, for example, like having alternative accounts on your Facebook or alternative accounts on Instagram as a way of like circumventing surveillance from your community is something that you already do in many ways in your physical world. You don't necessarily clone yourself, but you find ways of navigating that. And so I think it's just understanding that there are like some social practices and cultural practices that like replicate themselves on internet space in digital spaces. And I think that it's really, really important for us to not just think about like digital tools as something as our savior. I don't believe in tech solutionism, and I don't think anyone should. I think technology is just a tool, and it's a tool for us to use for the best of our abilities and what we wait for public good. So, yeah.
Excellent. So the next one is focused on the surveillance. So what are your thoughts on the relationship between surveillance data we might not want, and what Mimi Onua calls missing data sets, holes we might want to be filled?
Yeah, I actually really love Mimi's work. Mimi is an educator and an artist based in New York. Her work was actually part of the Glassroom project that happened in New York and in London. I really love Mimi's work, and I think about this stuff all the time. I have these conversations with friends about how much do we actually want to digitally archive, right? Like what information is missing, but also how do we protect that information that's missing, because it's really difficult for you to navigate what is missing and what is important to you, but also what the infrastructure that is set in place for you to protect that information. So I think navigating archiving, which by the way, these conversations have been happening for a very long time, like what do you archive and what do you not archive? And so I think for me, it's difficult. It's difficult to think about like the fact that certain things can be tracked. And so what I've been doing more recently is actually looking into community infrastructure. So for example, co-ops that have servers that provide space for you to put information that's actually end-to-end encrypted. And even though that might not be accessible to everybody, it's a way of me kind of protecting the amount of information that I have. Because for example, I have photos from my childhood and photos from my parents' childhood, and I want to be able to place that somewhere, but it's like surveillance is totally real. And so you have to like find ways to like circumvent that. And I think Mimi's work is really good, and I think all of you should look into that because there's a constant question about what do you archive and what do you not archive, especially because everyone is watching. So, yeah.
There's a question just in the middle of the room.
Yeah.
So,
Alexander.
yeah, thank you so much for your remarks and for all the great work you do. I was just wondering, because you referenced James Baldwin in your presentation, what James Baldwin and some of his peers may think about our conversations around inclusion and equity in a digital age.
Do you want the honest answer? So actually, I have a lot of friends who study political philosophy, especially like Black political thought. And I remember talking about digital inclusion and my friends talking about the fact that it's also super integrationalist, right? Like in its format. It's not that you actually want to build tools to better suit the people that are working with it. In many ways, you want them to just be happy with what they have. Like, be happy that you have access to the internet. Be happy that you have access to this tool, and not actually building tools that help and support them in the work that they want to do. So I don't know what James Baldwin would think, but I think that quote really states, like, do we want to be integrated into a burning house? And I think at the current moment, we have to be honest about that, right? The way inclusion has been currently talked about, it's very integrationalist, right? It's very like, get on board, everyone. The digital society is happening. So you gotta come on board some way, shape, or form. And I think that's wrong because we are not thinking about the hazards that come with that. And so I think James Baldwin and also a lot of other Black activists have talked about that, about the fact that we haven't been critical about that. And actually the research that I was talking about, it's not only Virginia Eubanks, but there are other researchers that have called out the fact that it's not just about integration, right? It's not. It's about power. It's about agency. Because if we're going to fight back, if we're going to do all of us or none of us, we have to understand the systems that are set in place. And guess what? A lot of it is run by corporations. And so let's be real about that. And let's be real about our relationship to that. And so I think James Baldwin would probably say what James Baldwin said in that quote.
Excellent. Another question from the room? Okay, then we'll go back to Slido. So how much is it the responsibility of companies and institutions to be more transparent about collecting data, and how much that the public should educate themselves?
Okay, so actually I want to hit both of those, if that's okay. So there's also another question under that is like, what should we think about smart cities, initiatives like smart cities? So I think it's important to think about both of those because I think they relate to each other. And so I think it is extremely onus on a company to be open about their information. I know that we think about obviously like market value and the fact that we're in a competition and all of that kind of stuff, but I actually think it is actually really important for us to have open source information, open source data, open source platforms so that we can understand the ways in the system actually operates, right? And so I think that is super, super important. And I think it's really interesting that the way, wrap up, but I think it's really interesting the way that you say that citizens should educate themselves. I actually think it's the other way around. I think that it's actually the role of, governments and also other civil society organizations to think about this because there isn't a lot of capacity right now for someone to worry about the fact that they have a roof over their head, but also the fact that their data is being surveilled. We must understand the fact that we have made it super difficult for people to understand this. And that is the way the system is currently operating. It's supposed to be difficult to understand. It's supposed to be hard for you to figure out how that one information you shared went from point A to point B. And I think it's our role as practitioners to navigate that and make it more accessible. Because to the fact that we're putting so much onus on the person to understand that is a lot. And I think it's quite irresponsible because we have set this in place, right? We're the ones who've set up the contracts with organizations or corporations. We have set up the infrastructure there. And so how are you going to set up the infrastructure and then just let people fail and be like, why did you fail in this, right? And how did you not understand that this was going to get from point A to point B? And so I think that we have to be real about that. And I think that's with smart cities as well is one of the biggest conversations I'm having about smart cities, and I want you to all think about this, is how much foundational knowledge is necessary for us to make an informed decision about technology and public good, how much knowledge? We don't know, right? And we don't know how much we should know as citizens to make an informed decision about this stuff. And I think it's important for us to navigate that, and to navigate that with corporations, with civil society organizations, and with governments.
Excellent. Thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon,
you.
Nasma. It's a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Please join me in thanking Nasma.